Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm just going to wait about 60 seconds for participants to get logged into the webinar. Go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar on permanent supportive housing, practices that support independent community living. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Ann Murphy, and I'm the co-director of this center and will be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We encourage you to visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And we encourage you to go to this bit.ly link to sign up to receive notifications from our center on our upcoming activities. We have, today's webinar is a one webinar in a series of webinars that we've been hosting on the recovery from serious mental illness and the practices that support recovery. So today is on supportive housing, but we have several more coming up over the next few months. We'll put the registration links for these upcoming webinars in the chat box. If you are interested in registering for any of the upcoming webinars, you can do so by clicking on the links in the chat box. They'll be there in just a couple minutes. Before we begin the rest of the webinar, I wanted to let you know that we, as a federally funded center, are required to evaluate the impact of our services. And one of the ways that we do that is by distributing an anonymous survey after the completion of our activities. So after this webinar, you will receive a very brief survey. It's only a few questions, should take you less than a minute to complete. And we would really appreciate you completing that. It lets the funders know that people are participating in our activities, and we utilize your feedback in order to improve our services going forward. We wanted to let you know that this webinar today will be recorded, and the recording of the webinar, as well as the webinar slides, will be posted on our website by the end of the week. Today's webinar will be interactive, so our presenters may ask you some questions throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to engage with the presenters using the chat box. You can also ask questions using the Q&A feature. Any questions that you have, myself and my colleague will be keeping track of the questions, and we will pose them to the presenters at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. If you have any other comments you want to share, please go right ahead and do that, either through the Q&A or the chat feature. So today's, we have two wonderful presenters with us. We have Dr. Zazzarino, who's an assistant professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions, where he's currently a core faculty member in the master's program in rehabilitation counseling and the doctoral program in psychiatric rehabilitation. Additionally, Dr. Zazzarino is the field experience coordinator for the counselor education and supervision track. Previously, Dr. Zazzarino provided instruction for professional education courses for New Jersey's supported housing agencies implementing community support services. Dr. Zazzarino is actively presenting at local, state, national, and international conferences related to sexual and gender minorities, multiculturalism, psychiatric rehabilitation methods, counseling services, housing, and supervision practices. In addition to his work at Rutgers, Dr. Zazzarino continues to conduct clinical work by facilitating group therapy for adolescents and adults at an intensive outpatient program, providing outpatient counseling services at his private practice, and providing clinical supervision for counselors who need supervised clinical hours. He'll also be presenting for us a webinar series that's starting later this month, and the announcement should be going out very soon. If you sign up for our email announcements, he'll be providing a whole webinar series on working with individuals of sexual and gender minority status. So look forward to that. Additionally, we have Dawn Reinhardt Wood with us. She's a lecturer here at Rutgers in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. She serves on a team of embedded consultants implementing evidence-based practices in New Jersey's state-run psychiatric hospitals. Prior to her employment here at Rutgers, she provided and oversaw the development of supportive housing and clinical case management services for individuals experiencing homelessness and psychiatric conditions. She's currently a doctoral candidate in the PhD in health sciences, and her research interests lie in the sexual health and social recovery of people living with psychiatric conditions. So we're very happy to have people here with us who know both the empirical support for supportive housing and have also done the day-to-day work in that area. And I will turn it over to them to provide the webinar.
Thank you, Anne.
Hi, everybody. This is Dawn. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thanks for joining us. So I wanted to go over, excuse me, some of the objectives of today's session. So today we're going to provide a broad overview of permanent supportive housing. We may often reference it simply as supportive housing, but we all are talking about permanent supportive housing. We're going to describe how permanent supportive housing can support a recovery journey and identify the evidence-based and promising practices that can support PSH and be integrated into its services. Now, recovery from serious mental illness has been studied and documented by researchers, practitioners, and individuals with lived experience around the world. Recovery is real and can be supported by practices and services that encourage participant engagement, community inclusion, valued social roles, and overall wellness. So when you think of permanent supportive housing, overall, what we're looking for is the achievement of housing stability and reduced homelessness to provide individuals with a framework for a launching pad for their future recovery from their psychiatric and other conditions. Thinking about individuals that we serve, they may have a myriad of conditions that we're assisting them with, whether it be psychiatric conditions, substance use disorders, physical issues, and many of the comorbid physical conditions that come along with, or we frequently see with, psychiatric conditions. The basic goals of almost any supportive housing program is to provide this stability and reduce episodes of homelessness, whether that be literal homelessness outdoors, or as we frequently see, incarceration, hospitalization, living from place to place without a lease. So in colloquial language, we call that couch surfing. So really not having that fixed address to start their recovery journey from. Ultimately, all PSH programs strive to provide this stable framework that contributes to the likelihood that recovery will happen and is possible for people living with severe psychiatric conditions. Can any of you think of any other goals of supportive housing programs that you may be familiar with?
Community integration, that's great. I think that's something that we're going to also talk about, the importance of community integration, and not just living in an environment in which you choose to live, but also socializing within the community with other members of the community and truly feeling like you belong as a part of that community. So we're definitely going to touch on that. That's a great response. Anybody else have any idea about the goals of supportive housing? If so, feel free to type them in the chat. All right. If they come to your mind as we keep going on, feel free to type that in and we'll incorporate that into the conversation.
Great. So thank you, Anthony. Some of the major permanent supportive housing services that you'll see in most programs are, number one, starting with engagement. Now, many permanent supportive housing programs receive referrals from, street outreach programs, from psychiatric hospitals, sometimes even jails, just criminal justice settings. And so one of the most fundamental activities in supportive housing is the engagement piece. So individual staff members and teams of staff members are able to engage with service recipients in the community and hopefully within the community of their choice. So in their homes, whether that be an apartment, sometimes a shared living situation, sometimes that engagement occurs before the individual even moves into an apartment. So outreach to individuals when they are actually in a psychiatric hospital, in a more restrictive residential setting, or a residential setting with more supervision, such as a group home. And so this engagement occurs in essence to help build the individual's readiness, understand where the individual is in terms of their needs and their readiness for housing, because similar to other changes that individuals will choose to make throughout their recovery, choosing housing is also an activity in which the individual must be ready.
And Dawn, I just want to add too, I think when we talk about permanent supportive housing, I can think about some of the work that we used to do and the length of time that people would be in housing and in our supportive housing services, and how crucial that engagement piece really is. Thinking about building a relationship and thinking about building a trusting relationship where people are opening up and allowing us to be a part of their lives, to support them in that overall recovery, I think is so crucial to the foundation of everything that we're doing in supportive housing. And just to add on, because I saw Tayaba, potentially if I said that name right, I hope I did.
Please correct us if we didn't.
Talking about their overall health. And I think that engagement piece is so critical, because the more that people feel like they can trust us and that we have that unconditional support, the better able we're going to be able to provide the services that do support that overall health.
Thank you, Anthony. And very often I think that the supportive housing team that is working with service recipients are often the closest individuals that the service recipients have in terms of supporting them in their recovery journey, in terms of the formalized supports and program services, right? So as you see through the progression on this slide, our boxes here, we move from engagement and outreach, which are really those fundamental first steps, but obviously occur and should occur throughout an individual's receipt of services or participation in services in supportive housing, because there is usually no time limit on how long an individual can receive supportive housing services. It would be really easy for an individual to kind of get lost or become forgotten in the services, especially if they're not experiencing a psychiatric crisis. Maybe they're not coming to the attention of their service providers. And so this consistent and regular outreach and engagement is so important to make sure that we're working towards the individual's goals and perhaps changing goals.
And Dawn, just to add to that, as you're talking about it, it makes me think of the many experiences of maybe people saying that they don't want the services right now, or maybe they need a short-term hospitalization, and then knowing that they have that support to come back to, and that engagement process is an ongoing process, because you're truly re-engaging with people all along their way on their journey. Even once people achieve goals, then they might take a step back from services, but then like many of us, when we need that extra support, it's that time to be re-engaged. So.
Absolutely. And I think that Anthony said something very important about hospitalization or respite time. And that is that one of the I will sing praises about supportive housing all day, but I think one of the most important aspects of supportive housing is that because of the housing piece, the vouchers that we will talk about later in this presentation, an individual's housing is secure when they enter a hospital for treatment. So hopefully individuals do not delay emergency treatment or that periodic treatment that somebody might need along the recovery journey for fear of losing their housing, which in the past they may have done, right? Because that, being out of your housing, being out of work for a while, not being able to pay your rent could very well jeopardize your housing, and that should not be the case in supportive housing. Okay, so we have skills training, which is the practice of skills and the mentoring of skills development by staff in the individual's actual, living setting. So whereas we can provide skills training in a day program or through outpatient services or in a hospital, what better place to provide skills training than in the environment where it's going to be expected to be used, right? So teaching people how to use public transportation, teaching people how to budget, teaching people how to develop coping skills in the community is so important. Advocacy, so advocacy, teaching individuals how to advocate for themselves and to get their needs met in the mental health system and beyond. And also in terms of speaking up for themselves, with significant others and with, the general public that they come in contact with. So all are very important aspects.
And sometimes I think, and we'll get into skills teaching a little bit later on, but skills teaching and advocacy, it's so important for staff to maybe sometimes model how to either perform a skill or model how to advocate for themselves in the community, at a doctor's office or at a prescriber's office when they're not actually even looking at the client. As a staff, being able to be present and model how do you redirect that is such an empowering a moment for the person receiving services.
Yeah, it truly is a unique position to be in as a supportive housing provider. Counseling and coaching. So very often we may be in the position as supportive housing providers to, to provide that supportive counseling. Perhaps, you may not be a licensed professional counselor. You may not be certified as a counselor, but that does not mean that you can't provide the coaching. You can't help teach coping skills. You can't be that ear, and you can't offer feedback to individuals when they're asking for your assistance or when you notice a change in individuals. Crisis management. So unfortunately, probably many of you have had to intervene during crises, no matter, what form of mental health services you're working in. This can be stressful. It can be challenging, but it's also reassuring for individuals receiving services that they have that person that they know is their advocate, working with them, that they know it's a person that they've formed a therapeutic rapport with, which I think many people probably feel that way in supportive housing, because we do develop these long-term relationships with our service recipients, and that there is somebody there to help or to call, to reach out to when perhaps situations are starting to escalate. And not only on the service recipient side, but also for the landlords and other individuals that may be involved in the service recipient's life, right? So it's better to have a good relationship with the housing provider, with the other service providers ahead of time before there's a crisis, so that we can get ahead of that and hopefully stave off negative situations. We have self-care, obviously helping to teach people using the skills training, and then beyond, also teaching people how to maintain their wellness through regular self-care. Also something that we should be modeling for our service recipients and practicing with them. So even taking walks or practicing meditation or these practices that help keep us well, we should also be introducing to our service recipients.
That's such an important concept, I think, that many staff seem to overlook, where we are giving 110% to the people we work with, and then don't take the time to actually practice some of those self-care strategies. So I remember as a supervisor in supportive housing, that was something I would always reinforce to the staff is you can't give and you can't give support to your clients or to your service recipients if you're not taking care of yourself first. And I don't think we could reiterate that more.
Yeah, absolutely. I would think that compassion fatigue is something that we all have to be aware of in this field. So providing tangible supports, you know, many supportive housing programs have even an on-call line where people can call and reach out for support. May not be an emergency, but I look at that as heading off crises, right? So being able to provide, you know, just generalized support, assisting people with things like applications, assisting people with phone calls that they have to make, helping to script interactions for individuals if it's their first time interacting with, say, like a service provider, but providing those real tangible supports to help them and support their skills acquisition in supportive housing.
Yeah, and just to add too, I think we're looking at building natural supports as well, so that all the service and all the support to the individual does not come directly from a paid support. The idea too of permanent supportive housing, even though Dawn said the length of time could be kind of long, is that we're hopefully working towards getting out of permanent supportive housing. And then what kind of support systems do the individuals have in place? One of the biggest things I remember when working with people, and if I would ask them, well, who's your emergency contact? And they would say, well, you. I would have to then reframe that to say, okay, well, maybe that could be a goal, right? Let's find somebody in your life that's not a paid support that you turn to as a natural support, just like any of us do. And I think part of that is normalizing the conversations with the people that we work with. That when I have stress and when I have difficulties in my life, I turn to these people and trying to bridge that gap for some of the people with building natural supports.
And as Anthony's talking, it's making me recall an individual that I worked with who I met 20 plus years ago when I entered the field. And in my last year of working in community mental health, because this individual was predeceased by many of his family members, and he was starting to age, and we know that with individuals who have serious psychiatric conditions, you know, they may acquire or develop physical health conditions at a much earlier age than individuals without serious psychiatric conditions. So unfortunately, we were in the position of being the individuals to help him transition to long-term care facility because he had no one else. And it was, you know, I was thankful that we could support him in that, but at the same time, I know that I would want a family member or a friend to help me with that. So even being able to help people make those plans that we all will have to make at some point in our life, but hopefully helping them pre-plan some of those issues that are going to come so that they have a plan for, okay, who will I call when I need to do this? Or who can my service provider reach out to, rather than it being the service provider who is making these plans. And collaboration. So work in supportive housing should be collaborative, should be led by the service recipient. And as Anthony said previously, you know, sometimes people can tell us to back off, or they don't want our services for a period of time, and that is okay, right? We want to continue to reach out and let them know that we're there, but it's okay to back off. Okay, so like other health conditions, people living with mental illness are able to recover, right? We've all recovered from something, whether it's been a broken arm, a period of depression, the flu. We've all had the opportunity to recover from something. SAMHSA established these 4 major areas that support recovery: health, purpose, home, and community. And so, you know, for this reason, supporting individuals with mental illness in supportive housing must be person-centered and person-driven, emphasizing unique strengths, needs, desires, and experiences of the individual receiving services. So addressing basic needs like having adequate housing, nutrition, medical care, support the recovery process. It's very difficult to make progress, through our recovery process if we don't have our basic needs met, or if we're worrying about where will I lay my head tonight and who are my support folks, right? So developing that sense of community and safety. So supportive housing is a keystone in the recovery process of many individuals.
And I think something Dawn mentioned earlier was about discussing and understanding people's valued life roles. And I think that specifically hits the idea of purpose, right? Mm-hmm. What drives people to achieve those goals? Is it because I value being a good uncle or a good neighbor? And trying to take the time to understand what people value, because for the most part, that's what motivates us to continue to not only receive the services needed, but continue to thrive and find that purpose in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So in psychiatric rehabilitation, very often we talk about, you know, these valued social roles, and how I don't think I've met one person in the psychiatric hospital where I consult, one person receiving services who said, my goal in life is to be a good, and forgive the language, patient, but I work in the inpatient environment. So my goal in life is not to be a good patient, it's to be a good spouse, partner, father, friend, right? To be a doctor, right? So finding out what that thing is that that person values is so important, because it really does making working towards those other short-term objectives have meaning. It gives a whole lot more meaning to managing, you know, your mental health and your physical health when you're working towards a much more meaningful goal.
And I know Dawn and I are really focusing on the service recipients with this presentation, but all of this information, if we applied it to ourselves in our own lives, I think is really true as well. And I think understanding how impactful valued social roles are for us, or understanding how important stable housing is for us, or natural supports is for us, allows you to really normalize that these are things that everybody not only needs, but should have. Because in the end, I mean, we're not that different than the people that we provide services to, if different at all.
Right. And I think that also, you know, knowing what your purpose is, knowing what you value, why you chose to work in the profession that you're working in, is very important, and it helps ground you and counteract some of that compassion fatigue that can happen. So let's talk a little bit about where individuals that we serve in permanent supportive housing may originate in terms of their previous housing status. So the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, in its report to Congress in 2011, found that about a quarter of emergency sheltered homeless individuals met the criteria for diagnosis of at least one mental illness. Now, again, keeping in mind that this only surveyed individuals who were willing to come to a shelter. There are people who avoid emergency shelter, sheltering in general, and were willing to, you know, report a mental health condition. Therefore, it's difficult to determine exactly how many individuals who are homeless and in need of housing are living with a mental illness.
And I think that's where the permanent supportive housing piece comes into play, right? We talk about that stable housing and the housing vouchers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we know that there's such a high correlation between homelessness and mental illness. So having that piece, the supportive housing piece of it, I think serves both parts. It serves the housing aspect and the support services.
So the core values and principles of permanent supportive housing is that individuals have the choice of the housing in which they will reside. So we know that sometimes housing options may be limited, and we're going to talk a little bit about the housing vouchers and how people actually, you know, are able to acquire housing. But the idea is that people shouldn't be just placed in housing, that they should have choice in housing. And that means that individuals are able to refuse housing as well, right? So you may work with an individual and it may take a very long time to find housing, and the next individual may accept the first apartment or housing arrangement that they see. So individuals have the choice in housing like we all do. Now, this does not mean that they're going to get their first choice in housing. I did not get my first choice in housing. But again, that the individual has some say, and that they can always plan on changing their living situation at some point in time in the future. Typically, individuals in permanent supportive housing are required to move or advised not to move more than once a year.
And thinking about that choice of housing, Dawn, it makes me think of a person who I was working with in the state psychiatric hospital and engaging them and trying to get them to move out into the community, and honoring that person's decision and honoring that person and respecting that person's decision about where they want to live. And what that actually meant was it took a little bit more time than both the state and our agency wanted to take, but this person really felt strongly connected to the Portuguese culture. And there is a part, there's a part of this city in New Jersey that has a really strong Portuguese connection. And it was really understanding and respecting that person's cultural background to support that choice. And I think the person ended up not being within our agency, but it was referring to a different housing agency in that county. Mm-hmm. But I remember when that person was discharged, her saying like, wow, this really makes a difference for me. And I think when we talk about the idea of recidivism, when we talk about people going back into the hospital, I wonder how much it has to do with choice and the environment in which they're living in. Because sometimes I even think of, my own life experiences. And when I was living in college in different dorm rooms, like I really enjoyed one dorm room better than another, and how much more stress. One set of roommates. Yeah, so the idea of housing, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but how important it is for somebody to have some choice, with the recognition that choice isn't unlimited all the time.
Sure. And sometimes we want to get somebody into the best housing option that they could settle on, because it's then easier to move them on from there than it is, like, say, directly from a hospital or directly from a jail setting or whatever it may be. But absolutely, finding that housing choice that the individual really values, I would think will serve them better in their recovery process.
And I think as we go through this, you can see the 6 points already up on the slide. It would be really interesting is, as we're talking about this, if you could add in the comments section, maybe some experience you have with these core values and principles as we keep discussing it, so we can integrate that into the conversation.
So in supportive housing, housing is separated from support services. So remember when I said an individual can tell us, hey, back off a little bit. I really don't want to work towards any goals right now, or I don't need your supports right now. I need some time to myself. That doesn't mean that they have to leave their housing, right? So an individual is not required to be continuously receiving our services while they are in the housing. PSH also values decent, safe, and affordable housing. And so when we talk about vouchers and some of the requirements of them, that is embedded within that process. So organizations that are providing housing or working with individuals who are seeking housing work towards certifying that the housing is safe, and those situations have to go through, or those residences have to go through inspections.
And I know the Fidelity model of permanent supportive housing speaks directly to the percentage of income that individuals should be paying towards rent. And I think they say 30%. And we know that there's certain vouchers that don't. So all of this is to say, as close as we can get to these ideals, it is best.
Permanent supportive housing should be integrated amongst individuals without a disability. So really, this is where, I believe somebody earlier mentioned community integration in the webinar chat. So yeah, we want individuals to reside in a community where they have the ability to come in contact with people who are not receiving services, who do not have a disability, right? To maximize community integration and social recovery. Individuals should have access to and equality in the housing process, and that's obviously following HUD standards and guidelines. And so we are also there as advocates to make sure that when people are meeting with landlords, when people are meeting with other housing managers, that their rights are being respected. Landlords cannot ask an individual why they are receiving Social Security. They shouldn't. So we're there to be that advocate and also to help people realize that they can advocate for themselves. And flexibility in the utilization of services and the intensity of services in supportive housing.
So I've seen that work many different ways, right? So there would be some people that we would meet with once a month because that's where they were at in their recovery. And sometimes they didn't want to deal with the staff more than once a month. And then there were some people that we would see 3 times a week. And I think where that flexibility and intensity of services comes into play is truly doing a good assessment of need, right? And tailoring the services to meet the needs of the people that we work with.
And also the understanding that those services, both the flexibility in the utilization and the intensity of services, can change over time, right? So an individual, when they're first enrolled in services, may need a tremendous amount of support to make that transition in the beginning, like many of us might when we're having some sort of life transition. And then that need may lessen, right? And then at another point in time, there might be a crisis and we may need to pick up and provide more services. So that there is a flexibility built into the program.
Lynette, just to speak directly to your comment about how to balance the need of housing versus the need of the community for the acute care bed, it truly makes me think of the systemic issues involved in housing and hospitalization. And I know in New Jersey, we were under a mandate of trying to get people out of the hospital within 21 days. And I think back to that individual who wanted to live in this specific community and balancing that out and really advocating, I think, for the person in the hospital to say, no, they're not coming out yet. And then being in a weird predicament because from the agency level, they were fighting with me to say, no, we need to take this person now because we have a decrease in census. Mm-hmm. So I think though this conversation isn't any that we are going to fix in the next 20 or 30 minutes, it's an important one to address because those factors do play a role in permanent supportive housing. Mm-hmm. Like how much time can we spend engaging? How much time can we spend valuing choice? And I always say the more the better, and keeping that in mind. And then I think it also helps you understand that we can only do so much, right? So using every bit of ability that we have to provide the services effectively.
So we know from the literature that permanent supportive housing works. It is continuing to accumulate an evidence base. There are studies being done in a variety of populations, and individuals tend to rate their satisfaction with supportive housing as highly rated. And as such, as this evidence continues to accumulate that it's an effective service, that service recipients feel like they benefit from supportive housing and that they're satisfied with the service, in many areas of the country, it's become a covered service. And so, like for New Jersey, what this means for us is that we provide what's called community support services. So it's fee for service for individuals who require these types of supports when they are discharged from either psychiatric institutions or coming in off the streets, or just simply determined in the community by their current service provider that they need these additional supports living in the community to support and to sustain their recovery.
Yeah, and I also know in New York State, they're looking at a more value-based reimbursement for services like this. So I think that demonstrates that people are aware that permanent supportive housing is not only effective, but really needed to support the people living in those services.
Absolutely. So one of the things that is very important when we think about supportive housing is that, there really is a science to it, I think. When I look back on the services that I provided, looking back retrospectively, I realized that we really did provide we went into every interaction with intention, right? So meaning that we are not just visiting people to check in, to have coffee. Of course, there's some of that socializing that happens so that individuals, we can model social skills for individuals. We can provide support in a normalized, less clinical setting. But also there are actual evidence-based practices that can be delivered within supportive housing that will support individuals' recovery. That supportive housing can support. So these are illness management and recovery, or IMR, motivational interviewing, cognitive enhancement or remediation, cognitive behavioral techniques, supported employment, supported education, and integrated treatment for co-occurring disorders. So this does not necessarily mean that we're going to deliver a supported employment program within a supportive housing program, but at the same time, we can support an individual's desire to develop their vocational skills, to achieve that valued life role of a worker, a business owner, a nurse, a doctor. And that also we can educate ourselves on some of the strategies that are used in these other evidence-based practices for utilization in supportive housing.
And I think just like we mentioned, flexible services and the flexible intensity of services, and I made mention about the matching the level of service to the area of need, you're really matching the specific interaction or that specific intervention to the person's goal, right? If somebody is, like Dawn just mentioned, thinking about getting a job, okay, then the intervention should be more focused around the employment aspect. So looking at the intentional interactions to truly match the person's goals. And then the other thing that we had mentioned is the idea and the importance of skills teaching and skill development. We know that many of the people that we work with who have a mental illness may lack some critical skills, and it might be because of a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe they never were taught the skill growing up. We know that individuals who have earlier ages of hospitalizations don't even get the opportunity to learn the skills that many of us use today to just live successfully in the community. And because we don't have the ability to learn the skills, we're unable to be as successful in the community, and it does create a barrier to achieving goals. So what ends up happening is when people don't have the ability to perform a skill, they tend to lean on other people who can. And in this case, they tend to lean on the staff in a supportive housing program. And I think what I have seen many times is staff who are really caring and supportive end up doing some of the skill development for the clients, for the individuals receiving services. And though it's nice and though it is caring, it is not helping somebody learn the skills. In fact, I think when staff take on that role and that responsibility, we're actually teaching some of the people in the services to become more dependent on the staff. And that's not the focus of supportive housing, right? The focus is on independence and being a part of the community. So without that skills training, skill deficits may result in that ongoing dependency from staff.
And just to piggyback on what Anthony says, you know, on the staff side, the more that we build a reliance of our service recipients on us, the more likely we may be to develop compassion fatigue and burnout. So that's also something that we want to keep in mind. You know, when supervising staff in the community, I would hear folks say, I'm going to do this for my service recipient because it's just easier for me to make this phone call. I can make this phone call in the car on my way back, you know, from the individual's residence. And, you know, it's a wonderful intention, but at the same time, it's not teaching the individual the skill that they need to make that phone call themselves. You could be there and support them, but you're not teaching them that skill. And also you're taking on one more thing in your workday. And that can have a detrimental effect on the staff's mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about the different types of skills, and, you know, if you can all take a minute to think about all the skills that you've needed to learn in order to live successfully in the community today. If we were in person, I would ask you to jot them all down, but you can still do it right now, wherever you're at. I think you would see that we are a collection of skills that we've learned to be able to live independently in the community. You know, they can fall into some categories like the social skills, independent living skills, illness management skills. But understanding how to perform a skill when needed is really important for our own lives to get to where we need to be. And it's really important for the people that we work with to teach them these different types of skills. You know, so socialization skills, it always was an interesting phone call when I was on call and I'd get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning from an individual to say, hey, I went next door to my neighbor's house because I needed a cigarette and now he's yelling at me. And talking about, okay, what's appropriate in terms of socialization skills? Let's talk about time in terms of maybe when it is appropriate and when it is not appropriate to just knock on a neighbor's door and socialize. Or even in terms of socialization skills of how to start a conversation with somebody and not just to go up to somebody in the community and say, hi, my name's Anthony, I have bipolar disorder. Those are all really important skills in order to feel like you are a part of that community and socialize with other people in the community, just like we all do. Independent living skills in order to keep the apartments that they're living in or houses up to certain standards if they have to get inspections. Health reasons is also important. Illness management skills, understanding when I might need to talk to a doctor in case I need a medication adjustment. Similar to if I'm not feeling well, how do I go to the doctor and how do I communicate to the doctor the symptoms that I'm experiencing so the doctor can prescribe me the right antibiotic or the right medication. Vocational skills, we all know that vocation and employment is a really big part of people's recovery. We know that people who are on SSI have a very limited income, and helping people obtain a job is a way to increase that income. Nowadays, I think vocational skills go hand in hand with technology skills, right? How to use technology, because even to get a job nowadays, you have to do a lot of work online. So it's just really important to think about for ourselves what kinds of skills we've needed to learn and perform effectively. And also, what types of skills are you still trying to enhance and improve in our own lives? So we talk about skills too for tenancy. One of the things, and this is as we shift away from the services end and really focus in on the housing piece, is keeping in mind that for the housing aspect, what we're trying to do is teach people to be a good tenant. Because in theory, that's what a landlord is looking for. For the most part, landlords don't necessarily care about the individual living in their house and who's coming to visit them. They're more concerned with, am I going to get paid? Is my rent going to be on time? Is the place going to be safe? So thinking about the skills that we all use in order to live in the house and be a good tenant. So communication skills. If something goes wrong within the apartment or within the house, how do I communicate effectively to my landlord? Yet again, maybe calling my landlord at 3 o'clock in the morning to let them know a light bulb is out is not the most effective time to do that. And maybe not yelling at them on the phone. So having really good communication skills to navigate tough conversations with landlords. Coping skills. Something that I always found was really interesting, and it took me a while to understand this, was working with people when they would first come out of the hospital, and the level of noise that they would have in their apartments, keeping the TV on all hours of the day and night at a really loud volume, playing the radio really loud, and understanding maybe why somebody was doing that. And it really, after having conversations, boiled down to that's what was comfortable, because that's where the environment that they came from. And for other people, it was to try to drown out some of the voices that they were hearing. So we know that if you're playing loud music at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, might not be the best skill if you're living in a building where your walls are connected to other people. So teaching people maybe other more appropriate coping skills to being a good tenant. Organizational skills, we talk about that related to the independent living skills, but organizational skills for how to keep your paperwork orderly, so when it comes time to maybe renew your lease, you have that paperwork that's needed. And I think even going a little bit further about a lease, just teaching people what it means to have a lease and to have your name on the lease. That it doesn't mean that you move in March 1st and you sign your lease March 1st, and then on May 1st, you can up and go and move somewhere else. So understanding what the importance of a lease is. And budgeting skills, we know that you have to pay your rent, right? So making sure that we're teaching people the skills to continue to be a good tenant. And then public transportation, knowing the community, knowing what's out there, and knowing how to get and navigate from one place to another independently, so that they're not always relying on staff to drive them from place to place. And I know that public transportation could be really difficult in some parts. So as much as you can, just like anything else, teaching people how to navigate public transportation. So just to keep going a little bit more on the housing aspect of permanent supportive housing, it is important to try to have tenants have a lease in their name. And we're going to talk about some of the obvious barriers as well, just to be mindful of. But the sense of empowerment that having a lease in that person's name brings to the table, right? So being able to say that this is your apartment, you're signing it, this is yours. It also is a really good way to separate the two between housing and services, so that you are still allowed to be in this apartment and still receive services without even if you want to, or if you don't, you're still able to stay in this housing. Leases lack the provisions that would not be found in leases held by someone who does not have a psychiatric disability. Leases are a lease. People don't have a lease, just a different lease, just because they're in permanent supportive housing. Leases are universal, and teaching people how to read a lease, what to look at in a lease, is such a good skill, because keep in mind, the goal is for them not to be receiving our services forever, and there might be a chance that they want to move again. So we're teaching them skills now that they can transfer to a later point in their life if they ever want to move. We spoke about this a little bit earlier, that housing is not time limited. The lease is renewable at the tenant's and the owner's option. So services are also not time limited, but somebody can maybe stay in this one housing for as long as that the landlord would like to renew their lease. Housing is integrated, I think, is an important aspect. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but truly being in an environment where people can socialize with everybody in the community. And this specific point, I don't think resonated with me so much when I was providing housing as it did once I left and started reading more about it. It makes me think of this housing unit in this little city that in New Jersey that we built a 10-bedroom apartment in, and they were beautiful. It was 10 individualized apartments. 3 were 1-bedroom apartments, 7 of them were studios, and they were really, really nice. And the people living there loved it. However, all 10 bedrooms were leased to people who had a mental health diagnosis. So when we take a step back, really thinking about how do we integrate housing, because if you think about the people in your own lives, you probably have different people with different personalities and different interests, and they all bring something to your life. And the same should be true for the people we're providing services to. So what we ended up doing was integrating some housing. So we had another site that had 7 individual apartments, and only I think 4 of them were for people with a mental illness on a voucher, and 3 of them were for anybody in the community. So to truly try to integrate the housing piece. And then housing is also affordable, right? So tenants should pay no more than 30%. And how do we make housing more affordable is through housing vouchers. So there's a bunch of different types of housing approaches, and this kind of speaks to the individual's choice on housing. So sometimes when we have an opening in permanent supportive housing, the only opening is for this one specific location. So it is recognizing that sometimes choice is limited. And I think it's being honest about that conversation with the people we provide services to say, hey, we have a housing option in this town. It's a bedroom within a 2-bedroom apartment. You would be having a roommate. Does this sound like something that you would be interested in? Knowing that maybe after a year or after 2 years, we might be able to have some flexibility in that and look for a different option. I think part of that is just being honest with the people we provide services to so they can make an informed decision about what they would prefer. Would they prefer to maybe stay in a short-term facility while other housing options open up? Or is it better to get out in the community, being able to practice the skills that are needed to live in the community? Because like Dawn said, the best way to teach people skills is to teach in the environment in which they're living in. So helping people get out in the community gives them more time to learn those community living skills versus practicing hospital living skills, which are very different. So just knowing the different types of housing that fall in line with permanent supportive housing. So it could be a project-based rental assistance. You can have a sponsor-based rental assistance, tenant-based. Ideally, the tenant-based are the most ideal because the voucher then stays with that person and they can move from area to area. But with that, then increases the percentage of rent based on income. I think depending, it goes from either 30 up to 40, or even some tenant-based is up to 45. Recognizing, do we have a single site or do we have scattered site housing? And all of this, if you're interested, we could email you with the PowerPoint, the fidelity scale for permanent supportive housing that really allows you to evaluate your program and see how you stand up to the fidelity of the model. It is already in the resource list, so that's helpful. But I will say, just because you are not perfect doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It's working within the confines of what you're able to do.
And also, I think thinking about what fits the needs of the individuals that you're serving, right? So you may not live in an area where you're able to achieve scattered site housing, which might be ideal, right? So that we have people throughout a community, maybe throughout a county, really integrated into the community. There were sections of the county that I primarily worked in that were very, very remote, and there were very few housing options if an individual wanted to live there versus, you know, some of the towns that were more suburban of a larger city where there were many more housing options. So, you know, when you take a look at the PSH fidelity tool, keep in mind that, you know, yes, we want to be as close to the model as possible, but that sometimes, you know, your population may have specific needs, and you may have specific characteristics in your community that may make some of these goals difficult.
Absolutely. And then the next piece is just about the different rental assistance programs. And these are here, I think, just to remind staff that part of our job is to educate ourselves and continue to stay educated on what rental assistance programs are open. So I know Section 8 vouchers are really hard to get. However, it's being vigilant and being aware is when they open up new applications for Section 8 vouchers. And part of that is teaching the individual served to look for these openings, but we can't teach a skill or we can't model a skill unless we know how to do that ourselves. So being more mindful of these different rental assistance programs and understanding why it's important to be mindful, because these rental assistance programs will help subsidize the rent for the individuals being served. Because if everybody ever looked at the SSI rate, that is not a very high monthly income to cover rent and everything that comes along with it. So we know that housing is such stable housing is such an important piece to recovery. Rental assistance programs are a way to support stable housing. Challenges with vouchers. Even though that these are a very important piece of the housing, the stable housing component, it is a really difficult process. I think after my 10 years of working in supportive housing, I maybe understood 70% of the voucher process because I felt like it was always changing. I felt like depending on who I was going to for vouchers, they would require different things. So part of that is understanding that it is a multi-layered application process. So when we talk about skills teaching and skill development for the people we're providing services for, that organization comes into play. The coping skills, like how do you deal with the pages and pages of information that these vouchers are asking you to do? How do you focus to complete the application process? I mentioned this already, but missing some of the advertisements. And for some voucher processes, the advertisements only open up once a year or once every other year. So if you miss it that one time, it really puts a strain on housing options for the people we provide services for.
So I would like to interject and say that it's probably really important. No, not probably. It is very important to, as staff, to make connections with the individuals at these entities who will be publicizing waitlist openings and you know, the acceptance of applications, whether that be someone at a county housing office or with the state, you know, forging some relationships so that you are made aware when the waiting lists are open.
This next one, I started to chuckle, so I was glad Dawn stepped in there, but locating people when it's time to update their status or offer a voucher. Because services and housing should be separate, sometimes people would be living independently, and then I would try to reach out to say, hey, I know you're not receiving services from us. However, I do know that there is a Section 8 voucher open that might be a really good opportunity. And I would call and I would not get an answer. I'd show up and they wouldn't answer. So that locating people is so important. So I think it's having that conversation with people, even though housing and services should be separate, still staying connected in one way is important. Lack of documentation and identification to apply. that's a really important aspect, and something that right before I was leaving, we were making sure that anybody who came to our housing agency from the hospital setting had to have specific identification. And that was a big, I think, movement within the hospitals, was making sure that every client within the hospital was able to have a birth certificate, was able to have a social security card. And that was, I think, a really good push from their end, because we know that if you don't have documentation to apply for certain vouchers, you can't get them. And we also know that the time it takes to get documentation might make somebody miss that open window to get the voucher. So making sure we have documentation is important. Scheduling and keeping appointments is a really important skill to teach, not only to meet with services, but to meet with other providers. And then this last piece is another really difficult challenge with vouchers, is a past criminal history or eviction history. I know that if somebody does have an eviction on their record within a voucher, for some programs, you can't get another voucher for up to 7 years. That places a big strain on the housing program. So that's why I think it's really important when we have somebody move in, is teaching them how to be a good tenant. And being a good tenant means let's not get evicted, because what does eviction bring to you in the long run? I also know, sorry, just that past criminal history piece makes it sometimes difficult with the lease in their own name. And sometimes, and this is where I say, as much as you can do in housing, you do. So sometimes we would have the lease in the agency and then sublease it to the individual, just so they still had a sense of empowerment. But I think this is why it's so important to build relationships with good landlords in the community. And I think it's why it's also important to be honest and realistic with sometimes those housing choices might not be unlimited. Not because we don't want them to be unlimited, because there are just some challenges in terms of that past criminal history or eviction history. So the last slide we have for you today before we open it up for question and answers is the actual challenges locating an apartment. So we talked through the process of getting a voucher and having that rental subsidy, but once you have that rental subsidy, housing just doesn't come to you, right? It is still important to go out and locate housing. So one of the biggest challenges is just communicating with landlords, right? How much do we share with a landlord, being mindful of tenant rights? You know, Dawn mentioned earlier that a landlord should not be asking about somebody's hospitalization, should not be asking about, well, who are you? Why are you providing services to this person? Passing screenings and background checks. Even sometimes for certain apartments, it's even the application fee, you know, and knowing resources in the community to help maybe support people in terms of background checks, security deposits, rental assistance, furniture assistance, you know, the moving costs. So those are also really important challenges, because sometimes when people enter our housing programs, they might not have those resources. Locating an apartment that has accessible transportation. There's certain communities where public transportation is few and far between. Recognizing what that then does for the staff, puts more of a reliance on staff for transportation. Security deposits and first month rent we talked about, and just the continuing engagement throughout the process. This is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I saw was the time it would take to actually secure an apartment, and then people still wanting to engage with us. When I was working in the hospitals and helping people come into the community, sometimes it would take 3-4 months. And now, you know, telling somebody it's going to take a couple months to find an apartment, get everything situated, is really discouraging for that person, and it could make that person say, forget it, I don't want to work with you. Or when I would work with people who were homeless, that was, I think, an even more difficulty for me, because and I'm talking about homeless as in living on the streets, living in the woods, trying to engage with them so that they would be open and comfortable with me coming out repetitively, trying to find them and say, hey, I'm on your side, I'm trying to help you out here. That process, I think, I found took a little bit longer to even get to the point of filling out paperwork for a voucher, was just to engage with people to build that trust. So I think all of this is to say that, you know, earlier we talked about how important housing is. And I think we would be neglectful if we didn't address that there are challenges in terms of the housing piece, but it is possible. And I think there are really great opportunities for service housing providers to build these relationships with landlords and with community stakeholders. So that concludes our part of this conversation, but it does not conclude the presentation, because this is your time to shine. So are there any questions and answers? And we'll turn it over.
Thank you, Anthony and Dawn. So yeah, I encourage any of the participants on the webinar to type into the chat box any questions they have that you'd like for us to pose to our presenters here. We do have a couple questions that we've received thus far that I will present, but while I'm doing that, please feel free to add additional questions. So one of the questions is about resources to help individuals with skill building for living with housemates or resolving housemate conflict before getting to the point where it might require landlord involvement or threaten the stability of their housing.
So there's two resources that come to mind. The first one is Tools for Tenants, which is on SAMHSA's website. So we'll post that in the chat so you can see. If you just Google SAMHSA Tools for Tenants, it's a really good modularized manual, really small. When I say manual, it is really small, that you can use to structure conversations and teach people what it means to be a good tenant. And I believe one of the modules is about being a good neighbor and teaching somebody what does that mean. The other good resource, and it is in the references, I'll put the references up now, this Bellac book. I know it's a 2004 reference, which might seem a little dated, but it is such a good book that helps people break down that process of skills teaching, and it gives you that step-by-step process in how to teach people different skills. And there are skills in there directly related to like having a difficult conversation, just saying no, well, it's refusing a request. And it helps you, I think, frame that skills teaching process in a different way than you would normally think of. So if you look, it's the first reference on the slide right here, Bellac, Muser, Gingrich, and Agresta, 2004 Social Skills Training for Schizophrenia. That, and then Dr. Murphy just put in the chat box, the Tools for Tenants. Good question.
Great, thank you. You can leave it back on the resources, maybe it's good for folks. Okay, so we had another question come in about hygiene. How do you address hygiene without offending?
Anthony is looking at me. So I think that this also goes into that. There are so many difficult conversations that we have to have in life, right? Mm-hmm. So again, I think that finding out, number one, what the person's goal in life is now, and I'm saying, you know, think about it that big, right? So it may not be important to an individual to have the most coiffed hair or to smell amazing or to even, to brush their teeth daily or whatever it may be, right? But it may be really important to that person to find a job, or it may be really important to that person to date, to find a significant other. So thinking about hygiene or any of these other issues in relation to what the person's overall rehabilitation goal is probably will help you with the conversation, right? So saying things like, I've noticed, that there is this issue with your hygiene, and I want to help you. Like, it might be the person may have not learned the skill to address the hygiene. So getting back to what Anthony referred to with the onset of many psychiatric conditions tend to interrupt regular adolescent and adult development and skills acquisition. So really, reviewing what you're noticing with the person, how you might be able to help them address that. An individual may not want your help, and that's okay too, as long as it's not jeopardizing their housing situation, where they might be ignoring washing dishes and these sorts of things. But trying to attach it to what that person's valued social role is and what their overall rehabilitation goal is, rather than being the best smelling tenant in supportive housing. It's, presenting ourselves in such a way that we can increase the likelihood that we're going to achieve that goal that we have.
Yeah, and I also think it comes down to the type of relationship you have with the person. And I think that's why that relationship is so key. Because I think about it in my own life, the people that are closest to me, there's some days when they're like, wow, you have to shave. And I would take that differently from somebody who I know is looking out for me versus just a stranger that I don't have a relationship with. So that relationship, I think, is very critical in having those tough conversations, because the tough conversations are not going to end. If it's not hygiene, it's probably going to be something else.
So I just, I have an additional comment, and I guess it relates to the hygiene, but I think for me, it actually is associated more with when I was in the field, and I didn't work in supportive housing, but with people who were involved in supportive housing. There was often a lot around the cleanliness of the apartment. And sometimes I would see that the expectations were very high, that the apartment had to be very, very clean. And I thought to myself, I know plenty of people who, don't have a mental health condition, who don't have clean apartments, right? Now, to your point, Dawn, if it's something that's attracting, bugs or rodents or something that can jeopardize their housing, that's one thing. But it seems to me that sometimes we hold people to a standard, or we don't take into account that there's just individual differences that may not be related to having a mental health condition or anything else.
One of the reports that I hear frequently in the hospital setting is, well, this person isn't ready to be discharged because they don't even make their bed in the morning. Well, I don't make my bed in the morning because I don't see the point, because I'm just going to get back in it at the end of the day, right? So, and people vary, in how they address the things. So I think that's so important, Anne, is that we have to keep in mind, like, what is safety and what might be holding somebody back in their recovery versus this is the way the person is comfortable and lives, and it's not jeopardizing anyone. But I think that's a great question. Hygiene is difficult to talk about.
I'm looking at the chat, and I think it's really important to address this question. So it says, I work with PACT. Oh, sorry, the chat box just moved. I work with PAC and blah, blah. I'm trying to get to it.
Here, I work with PACT, and we have encountered at several apartment complexes that they're now asking individuals to provide proof of income, which is 3 times the monthly rent. Even with presenting the housing voucher and Social Security, receiving Social Security, there's no way they will qualify. I personally feel this is a backdoor discrimination. How do we as providers work around this?
So I remember part of this, I think, comes down to the idea that landlords feel like they can do what they want and don't understand the tenant rights. In New Jersey, at least, I know every county has free legal aid. And I remember going to them a couple of times to advocate for certain things like this and kind of work through this process. But I think it also, because that takes a while, it goes back to like really finding good landlords that you've just built a good relationship with. And I know that then limits the options that we have, but having a few good options is better than having no options, I guess. So I do think it goes down to building relationships with positive landlords in the community, because it's going to take a bit to correct that problem, but I would agree with you as well.
So Angel says that their biggest issue is having to hand out lease violations and ruining the rapport. Yeah, absolutely. If you're the service provider, you really should not be the person handing out lease violations. But I understand and I empathize with the pain that you feel, because in my former role, my organization had placed us in that situation as well, because we had a separate entity that was a property management organization that some of our individuals rented from, some of our individuals receiving services. And so this property management organization, because they were loosely affiliated with us, thought that these housing violations would be received so much better if they were received by the tenants from their supportive housing case managers or service providers. And it was so detrimental to the therapeutic rapport. You're absolutely right, Angel, and really should be kept separate. This is a really clear illustration of why the housing and the supports should be separated.
Absolutely. We actually, towards the last, I think, couple years of working in supportive housing, we had an entire separate entity within our agency that did all those, the lease violations, the inspections even, just so that me as a service provider didn't have to go out and talk to the individual about, okay, let's clean this up, let's do that. So they could see us from more of that service standpoint, and these other people as these are the people coming in for the housing aspect.
Okay, I have a couple additional questions here. And anybody participating, please feel free to keep posting questions. But I had a question about the vouchers, because you guys mentioned past criminal history. I was wondering if you knew if there were actually restrictions on being allowed to receive a voucher if you had a criminal history.
I think that there may be some around distributing controlled dangerous substances and violent crimes, felonies maybe.
As opposed to misdemeanors.
As opposed to misdemeanors. The other, where you may also run into sticky situations is when an individual may have been arrested and adjudicated and ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. Sometimes things still pop up on background checks. And so it's really important that you have that open and honest relationship with the individual receiving services so that you know their full history.
It makes me think of a situation that we had where we were trying to get this individual a voucher, and we did all the paperwork and they got denied because something did pop up that was supposed to be expunged, and having to go down to the courthouse and get letters to provide and show proof to the housing voucher. So that stuff does happen, and I think that's where talking through the process with potential tenants is so important. Just keep that process transparent and let them know. And this is what I would always tell staff: patience. I think patience is probably the best skill that's needed between teaching people skills and also going through this process.
So I have two additional questions sort of on similar topics. So one is about a client who's a registered sex offender. And should the worker disclose that to the landlord, or should the client disclose that? And maybe how you might go about if the recommendation is to have the client disclose it, just make the disclosure would you recommend doing some work with the client to practice and prepare how you would go about making that disclosure?
Well, I think part of that is understanding the rules and regulations for the different tiers, right? And, different tiers bring about different obligations in terms of who do I disclose to, how do I disclose, do I go to the local police department because they need to know if you're a specific tier. There are also some tiers that you don't have to disclose at all. So I think to answer that question, I think it's about educating ourselves and educating the client on where that person's at and what level of disclosure is needed. And I think if that level of disclosure meets the requirement of notifying the landlord and even like the community, I would definitely do some work, but would encourage the client themselves, because I think that's the time to teach advocacy and empowerment. Yeah.
And I would also like to interject, if we know that this is a situation that may need to be disclosed, obviously, ideally, you would want the person receiving services to do that as a best practice, but then also preparing ahead of time a script, so to speak, to have the person really reflect and write a statement down, prepare what they're going to say, and to practice. Practice that. I think some of that might actually be in tools for tenants, like role playing, practicing these difficult conversations. But Anthony is correct. Some of the tiers, only require the individual to report to their local police department annually or whenever they move, and may not require public disclosure. So
there's also a comment about Section 8 that some landlords don't want to accept Section 8 because of the extensive paperwork and also sometimes stigma related to tenants that qualify for Section 8.
One of the things that I know that I tried to do when I was working in supportive housing, when I faced this issue, which is a very real issue, because we could all tell horror stories of, the apartment with, 20 people living in it on one voucher, right? There are these things that I understand why landlords might have some concerns, because you only remember those most negative stories, right? When you're not exposed to the daily positives that happen. But one of the things that I used to utilize as a selling point for any kind of voucher was, this is guaranteeing at least 60 to 70% of you, the landlord's monthly rent. You don't typically have that with anyone that's not receiving a voucher, right? So it's at the very least guaranteeing the majority of your rent will be delivered to you on a monthly basis. And that, explaining your role as that support person, not only to the individual that's receiving services and looking to rent from the landlord, but also somewhat of a support to the landlord, right? In navigating that process. And yes, trying to make it as painless as possible for the landlord.
Yeah, we actually set up a monthly, they actually went to every other month, meeting where we would invite landlords from the community into the agency at night when there was no individuals around, but to just offer support in how to navigate different systems, even if we did not have anybody placed with that landlord at the time, just because it was a great way to build those relationships going forward and to let them know that we are here as a support for you all. We entice them with some pizza and soda, but the long-term impact of that was so beneficial to the people that we were providing services for when it came time for placement in the community.
Great. So we only have about 1 minute left, but I wanted to end maybe with just maybe 30 seconds each from you about what qualities you saw in some of the best supportive housing staff members, things that you thought made them really well suited to providing excellent housing supports.
Well, we left our programs and we're here now. So just kidding.
No, I would say openness. I would say openness and flexibility and patience. Those are my three, because I think we're working with people who have very different needs, just like us, and being open to understanding that what I would do for one person in order to support them is very different than what I might do for somebody else. And I think that includes that flexibility piece. Also being flexible to understand that I might not know the answer, and that's okay. That supportive housing staff, they don't need to know everything. They need to be open to learning about things, and then just patience, because teaching people skills and teaching them in a structured way and repeating that skill and trying to teach people to become more independent takes a lot of time. And I think patience is important.
Yeah, I would reiterate probably the openness and patience and the willingness to be resourceful and to put a little bit of, time into finding out, these answers to questions that people might have. One of the best supportive housing staff members that I worked with was an individual who actually used to receive services from us and in essence graduated out of supportive housing, meaning she moved into her own apartment, which she was able to pay for, through salary from our organization. And one of the things that she did was every time a person asked her a question that she didn't know an answer to, especially regarding community resources or medications or treatment, she would look it up. She would print out or make a note of whatever she learned, and she would put it in a binder, and she would actually label it like with a topic area. And it actually was amazing because these were all things that you can't necessarily think of providing folks in training, but it created a great resource for her coworkers, for herself. And so that ability or that willingness to do that research and put in a little bit of prep work before seeing individuals is so important.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for those responses, thinking on your feet, and also for the wonderful presentation. And thank you to all of the participants. We really appreciate your comments and participation here. We will follow this webinar up with an email that has a link to our very brief survey. We'll also include links to the Tools for Tenants and the SAMHSA Supportive Housing Toolkit, which includes the fidelity assessment, you will be receiving those by the end of the week. We'll also send a link to the recording of this webinar and the presentation slides, and you should feel free to share that with any of your colleagues who you think might benefit from listening to this. So thank you again to our presenters, and thanks to all who participated.